Hello and welcome. You're watching Nothing But the Truth. The Pathankot terror attack may be over, but the questions it's provoked hang heavily in the air. Was the attack itself handled commendably or ineptly? And in its wake, should the foreign secretaries go ahead with their proposed meeting on the 15th, or would it be wiser to postpone the comprehensive bilateral dialogue they intend to initiate? Those are the key issues I shall put to India's former National Security Advisor, former Director of the Intelligence Bureau and former Governor of Bengal, M.K. Narayanan. Mr. Narayanan, let's start with the way the Pathankot terror attack was handled before we come to the question whether the Foreign Secretary should go ahead with their meeting. As you know, the handling of the attack has attracted considerable criticism. As a former National Security Advisor, do you believe it was well handled or ineptly handled?
Mr. Karan Thapar, I think it is not proper to keep commenting on events and incidents when you don't have all the facts. And that is true in my case, and I think that it's true in a large percentage of those who are commenting about this. You know, there are many angles to an attack of this kind, and they all need to be comprehensively looked at and understood before you can try to assign blame or ineptitude in these matters. But having said that, I think there are certain standard operating procedures which I think should be followed in these cases. I'm not very sure whether they were followed or not. One, I quite agree that in terms of domain protection, etc., it's not the NSG but the local armed forces which are, or if they are not available, the police, which should have been used for such purposes. The NSG is basically a counter-terrorism force. They're good for pinpointed operations, and they have a different, what should I say, a mental attitude and approach, and even the weaponry that they have. The Departmental Security Corps, I think this is a moribund institution which should have been given up a long time ago. So if there was pinpointed intelligence, then I quite see the need to have strengthened the defenses, which in this case could have been the armed forces, certainly not the Garud force or the Air Force, etc. Now, why that was done, I can't say. There must be valid reasons, because I think all those in Delhi are fully aware of the basics and the standard operating procedures.
Can I pick up on that point? A couple of days ago, former Army Chief General V.P. Malik said that with 2 infantry divisions and 2 armoured brigades present in the next-door Pathankot cantonment, totaling over 50,000 troops, all of whom, he said, were well versed in flushing out terrorists and militants from large forests in Jammu and Kashmir, it was a serious mistake not to use them and rely instead on the NSG, who are not trained either to handle counter-terror operations or to operate in sprawling air bases. You're actually saying you agree this was a serious mistake?
I'm not really saying whether, I mean, I'm only saying that the NSG are used for pinpointed counter-terrorist operations. They are not to be used basically for, guarding large spaces. Now, in this case, if there were, I'm not aware of what the strengths are. If there were large forces available, I'm sure General Suhag, who's there, Dalbir would know what the strengths were. Why they were not used, I'm quite sure there must have been valid reasons for that. So rather than assign blame, I think we should look at what really prevented the armed forces from being employed on this case. I've already made the point that neither the Defense Services Corps or the Garud Air Force commandos are suited for the task, nor for that matter the NSG. If for some reason the army could not be deployed, I'm sure there must be some valid reasons for that.
Now, in fact, former Air Force Chief, Air Chief Marshal Fali Major said to me that in the absence of using the army, the security of the Pathankot base was left in the hands of the DSC, who are retired Jawans, the Garuds, who are raised for special Air Force tasks and not anti-terror operations, and the NSG, which, as you pointed out yourself, is neither a first responder and is actually intended for hostage-taking situations and not, in fact, terror operations. And Air Chief Marshal Major concluded that this meant that at a time when terrorists were prowling around the Pathankot base, the base was left improperly, if not inadequately, defended. Does that not follow?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, it's very easy post an event to find flaws or mistakes. I myself have been targeted several times when I was the NSA for failure to do things. But there are often very valid reasons. The only point I'm making is there might have been valid reasons why the Army was not pressed into service at that particular point in time. For the rest, I agree. I agree that neither the Garud Force nor the DSC, or for that matter the NSG, are capable of guarding an Air Force base. That is the task of persons with domain knowledge, domain capability. If the Army could not be used, then the Punjab Police should at least have been used for any reason. So rather than assign blame, I would rather look into what were the reasons that prevented the Army from being employed. There must have been valid reasons, I hope. And in that case, I'm quite sure the answers would be quite different from what the rest of the time we hear people talking about.
You're a former national security advisor. Can you think what the possible reasons might be for not deploying the Army and relying instead on the DSC, the Garud and the NSG?
No, it's possible. There's been so much talk about intelligence. The question really is, how good was the intelligence? I mean, a lot of claims have been made. I'm a little surprised because usually the intelligence is always the main accused in such cases. In this case, everybody's talking about intelligence, but intelligence is a very broad term. Perhaps the intelligence was not sufficiently pinpointed to realize that it was a major attack on a base. Clearly, this was a major operation, but I don't know whether the intelligence provided that kind of information. If that was the case, then probably they thought it could be handled by as a counter-terrorist operation of a limited variety. Now, otherwise, I'm unable to see why the Army would not have been used unless, as I said, there were some very valid reasons. I'm not aware of it. I don't think most people would be aware of it.
Let me put to you a reason.
I can't believe that.
Let me put to you a reason given by Defence Minister Parikar at the press conference he held. He said, A, that the Army has no mandate to operate in civilian areas, and B, he said, that 50% of the NSG is anyway made up of the Army, and therefore, presumably, he thinks the NSG would be as good as the Army in tackling the situation. Now, those were his explanations to why the Army wasn't used as the lead force in this operation. What do you make of that argument?
Well, I was present. I also helped in writing out the basics for the NSG. So I know that the NSG has two components, the Rangers and the other segment. The Rangers are there's the strong Army contingent, but as I said, there's a clear mandate as to what the NSG is capable of and what they should do. And they are not supposed to guard Army or Air Force bases. The reason why if you say that the protection was not given to the Army because the Army has no mandate to in civilian, but basically this was an Air Force base. This is a military establishment. So I don't quite buy that explanation. I'm quite sure there must have been some more valid reason why it was thought that we should not use the Army at this stage. So, and I don't want to go behind that and put forward the usual. It's very easy to blame. Yeah.
Let me then bring up with you another element where people believe the operation was poorly handled. It emerges that under instructions from authorities in Delhi, the officer commanding the operation in Pathankot was changed 3 times while the operation was underway. It was first Brigadier Anupinder Singh Belvi, then it was switched to Major General Dushyant Singh, and finally to Air Marshal S.B. Deo. Now, in the circumstances, do you think that was understandable, or do you think that was another mistake?
I thought there's a cardinal rule that you don't change your commanders midstream or in the middle of a battle. So I can't quite understand why this was done. Again, as I said, there may have been valid reasons, but if there's a sort of error in judgment about who should have been there in the first place, then I think we really need to look into that aspect.
Now, unfortunately, the terror attack is not the only area where improper handling and lapses were noticed. There are many other examples of lapses surrounding this entire episode. Firstly, what do you make of the fact that despite a full day's advance notice, and despite the fact that Pathankot Air Base has a 10-foot high wall with 2 feet of concertina wire on top of that, 6 terrorists with AK-47s, under-barrel grenade launchers, and perhaps 50 kilograms of bullets not only entered undetected, but reportedly were able to hide inside the base for possibly 24 hours before they actually undertook the attack. What does that tell you about the state of security at the Pathankot base?
2 things. One is either the intelligence was not as pinpointed as is now being claimed, that there was an attack being planned or scheduled on the Air Force base, and hence there was no security. 2, if there was, I can't imagine why it was not properly protected, certainly not by the Defense Service Corps, but by trained elements from the armed forces. I really am mystified that if the intelligence was so specific that there would be an attack and there was 24 hours time, that you would not have done what they did. So I think you'll have to go into that. I mean, I can't see any plausible reason why that should have happened.
Secondly, what do you make of the fact that the Pathankot terrorists apparently crossed over at the same point where 6 months earlier the Gurdaspur terrorists had entered India? Then they hijacked a police car and finally made their way from the border to Pathankot, crossing several police pickets without anyone stopping them. And all of this is happening at a time when this section of the border is presumably in a state of high alert.
Yeah, I think this certainly is a pretty bad commentary on the way we look at the border. But my feeling, this of course is based on past experience and not on present knowledge, is that this was part of a drug run. I'm quite sure that these people, I mean, it's said that the riverine route is always liable for entry, that the usual checks there were not working, etc. But I think there was a certain amount of aiding and abetting, and I think that's basically based on the drug angle. I think Punjab is awash with drugs, and that's all the time coming in basically from Pakistan. There are a huge number of what you call drug runners, as you might call them, performing their daily tasks.
Okay.
I think there is a tie-up between them and people at different levels, including the establishment, the police, and whatnot. So I presume that this was taken advantage of by those who planned the Pathankot operation to send in these people, and everybody took them to be maybe drug runners.
What do you make of
I must say, this is a kind of an off-the-cuff remark.
What do you make of the Gurdaspur SP, Salwinder Singh? He's given different accounts of how he was captured by the terrorists, how many there were, how many phones he had. On top of that, he claims they were unaware he was an SP, they didn't notice the blue light on his car, and whilst they killed Ikagar Singh, they didn't kill him or his cook. Finally, in a very sensitive district like Gurdaspur, which just 6 months earlier has witnessed serious terror attacks, he was out at night without his security staff. Are these grounds for suspicion, or are we being unfair to him?
I think we should give him a chance. I mean, of course, it does reek of all kinds of concerns, I would say. But I think either the man was probably because he was going without his guard, etc., and he's now trying to cover up all that kind of stuff. He's maybe saying one thing or the other. But I just don't want to sort of give a charge sheet on the basis of what we hear. I think we need to get a proper explanation, look into what he has done.
Okay.
And in any case, I think the SP Gurdaspur, that element is a kind of a red herring to the major incident of an attack on the Air Force base. And I think we shouldn't get diverted
Finally,
from that. I mean, what the SP did or did not do is it.
Finally, on the terror attack, before I come to the foreign policy talks, What do you make of the fact that the Home Minister, the Defence Minister and the Prime Minister, all three separately but individually, claimed on Saturday night that the operation had successfully finished, when in fact it continued for 24 hours and very possibly it continued for maybe 2 or 3 days more? Now, is that another illustration, an example of a lapse, this time at the political level?
No, I mean the Prime Minister, the Home Minister and the Defence Minister would say only what they have been told by the lower formations. So I think the guilt or the failure lies with those down below. Who told them this and why? I mean, the Prime Minister is not on the ground. He does not know what's happening, or for that matter, the Defence Minister or the Home Minister. This is information which is fed to him. I mean, even I, as NSA, tell my Prime Minister something, and he repeats it. Well, I suppose I'm guilty, not the Prime Minister. And if I would hold somebody who gave me the information guilty for having fed me.
Let's now come, Mr. Narayanan, to the Foreign Secretary level talks, which presently are still scheduled to take place on the 15th of January. In the present circumstances, do you as a former NSA believe they should go ahead, or should they be postponed, or should they be altogether called off?
This can't be answered in a single sentence. There is an obsession, I think, on the Indian side particularly, for talks at different levels. And the Foreign Secretary level talks have been invested with a certain glamour which I think it is totally uncalled for. I mean, we've had Foreign Secretary level talks, Defence Secretary level talks, talks at the NSA level, etc., going on for a very long time. So, if the reasons are, or I would say, if the conditions are not propitious, let us suspend it. I don't say call it off. You can suspend it and wait and see what happens. But one thing is very clear. I think we need to be clear, what are we going to talk about? If terror is the principal objective of the talks, etc., then I think we need to be clear what are we going to talk about, and what have the NSAs talked about in the past on this point. I think as building the entire sort of equation, the India-Pakistan equation onto the talks at the Foreign Secretary level, I think is investing too much on these talks. Foreign Secretary level talks have hardly met with any great success over the years.
India, speaking through the MEA official spokesperson Vikas Swarup, has said that A, the ball is in Pakistan's court, and B, it's looking for prompt and decisive action as promised by Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif. In your eyes, as the former NSA, what in the present circumstances would be decisive action by Pakistan?
Well, we would expect that they would take action against the top leadership of the JEM, Jaish-e-Mohammed. I mean, that I think would be decisive action. But even if they take decisive action, does it mean that it's the end of terror? And what are we looking for? Are we looking for lollipops from Pakistan? We have, I mean, our basic interest in talks with Pakistan is to sustain what I would like to call the strategic unity of the subcontinent. How do we move forward, etc. I think we're getting lost in individual terror attack. That they will continue. There's not going to be an end to terror, even if action is taken against the JEM. The JEM was moribund. It's been revived. Now the next will be the Lashkar. Next will be some other terrorist group. Okay. So I don't think that we should have hosannas if action is taken, or condemn if nothing happens. I think the idea is to understand what exactly and where we want, and where exactly are we with Pakistan.
But just to understand what you're saying, Mr. Narayanan, are you also saying that at the very least Pakistan must detain or arrest Maulana Masood Azhar, the head of the JEM, and the man that we believe is the mastermind behind his attack? That is the very least Pakistan must do. Is that what you're suggesting?
I mean, if in the case of 26/11 to 2008, we were insistent that people like Lakhvi and others should be arrested and put behind bars and the like. here is the mastermind of this particular attack. If all the intelligence reports, all the what I call the telephone intercepts, etc., show that this is. So that's the least I would expect. But my point is something more, that merely this action on one particular occasion doesn't make India-Pakistan buddies, to say the least. We have a basic conflict. We need to understand that India refuses to recognize, by and large, that there are fundamental problems in the relationship. And this cannot be done by high-level, foreign-level talk, grandstanding at various levels, and talking for the sake of talks.
I'm coming back once again to what has to be done in the short term, either to facilitate or to suspend the Foreign Secretary talks. Now, in the last 2 days, Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif has held 2 consecutive high-level meetings, including one which involved the Army Chief as well as the Director General of the ISI. Yesterday, they issued a joint statement which says, and I'm quoting, "The people of Pakistan have evolved a political consensus for action against all terrorists and terrorist organizations without any distinction, and have resolved that no terrorist would be allowed to use Pakistan's soil for committing terrorism anywhere in the world." In your eyes, is that sufficient for the Foreign Secretary talks to go ahead, or would you say that's insufficient? You have to take that additional step of arresting the mastermind and the other perpetrators whose names have been given by India to Pakistan.
Statements. More statements, more lies, more. I mean, if this was the assurance given to no less than the Prime Minister of India, Mr. Vajpayee, in 2004, and we have seen what has happened in the decade that has gone by. So statements of this kind have no meaning. In my point, even a temporary arrest, that's I think the terms that have been used, on Masood Azhar or any of his cohorts, is not the answer. I think we need to recognize that all that you want, and which I think to some extent is under Western pressure, is to hold talks. Then you can find any number of excuses, but I don't think this is going to improve the climate of India-Pakistan relations.
Finally, there is some suggestion that instead of the Foreign Secretaries talking, which could be postponed or suspended for a while, the 2 NSAs need to meet again, possibly in a third country without the media knowing until the talks are over, so that the terror issue can be once again discussed and maybe some progress made specifically on the Pathankot attack and the leads given by India. Do you think in the circumstances that would be a wiser course of action?
You know, I think if you give me a few minutes on this, I think the first thing is to avoid too many highly publicized talks, whether it is at the NSA level, the Foreign Secretary level, talks, etc. We need to really hold talks, what should I say, in a way which are not part of public knowledge. And I think one of the things is having the 2 intelligence chiefs to meet. I mean, you can't really keep the NSAs, whether they go to Bangkok or whether they go to Kazakhstan, to be secret. The intelligence chiefs have met. They've met in the past. When I was the NSA, when I was director, these meetings have taken place. And far more fruitful things have taken place. And this is what we need. Not grandstanding, not this public displays of friendship or talks, etc., but solid, hard work. And I think along with that, a little less of summit diplomacy, because I think summit diplomacy has never led to any great success in most cases, and certainly not in the case of India and Pakistan.
Very quickly, because time is our enemy and we have very little time left, are you therefore suggesting that the Christmas visit to Lahore to greet Nawaz Sharif on his birthday was an impetuous mistake rather than a game-changing decision?
It's certainly not a game-changing decision, that much is it. But whether I don't want to call it a mistake. It was an impetuous action of a Prime Minister who wishes to extend the hand of friendship. But that does not lead us anywhere in terms of diplomacy is concerned. It's a human relationship, and I think Nawaz Sharif is one of the Prime Ministers with whom I think successive Prime Ministers, whether it is Narasimha Rao, whether it is Chandrasekhar, and others, they've all had reasonably good relationship, but it hasn't led to better India-Pakistan relations.
But has it boxed Mr. Modi into a corner? Because now people say that if he goes ahead with talks after Pathankot, he will be accused of backtracking on his original position that talks and terror cannot go together. On the other hand, if he doesn't go ahead with talks after Pathankot, people will say his Christmas visit was just a gimmick, that he's lost his nerve, he doesn't have conviction. Is he therefore caught between the devil and the deep blue sea?
Well, I mean, this is what I said, the perils of summit diplomacy. Because everything is in the public gaze, what you say and what you do is sometimes known and sometimes not known. And therefore, there are issues that have come up. I think if a Prime Minister is strong, I think that Mr. Modi doesn't have to look over his shoulders on that point. He can ride it. But what he learns to take away from this is that there is no substitute for solid hard work at the levels where work is normally done. At the lower levels of the bureaucracy, at the level, as I said, of some back channel negotiations, rather than grandstanding in public.
There, Mr. Narayanan, we're going to have to leave it. My thanks to you for agreeing to speak to us. That was M.K. Narayanan, former Director of the Intelligence Bureau, former Governor of Bengal, and former National Security Advisor, speaking exclusively to nothing but the truth. Goodbye. Good night.